The really important one is the alkalinity. That's what we also call the buffer capacity, because that is what has the ability to buffer and counterbalance those coffee acids.
We tend to, try and keep things simple for our clients and work towards a 12-month preventative maintenance cycle.
A few years back, one of our customers, their boiler was so corroded that it developed a hole in it and it started leaking out all over the electrics.
Yeah, and in terms of hardness, we generally saw that a lot of coffees, they react positively if you increase hardness in terms of aroma.
Welcome back to the 5THWAVE podcast. I'm Jeffrey Young, Editor-in-Chief of coffee business magazine 5THWAVE. When opening a coffee shop, operators will frequently set aside a small fortune for an iconic espresso machine. But when customers put an espresso to their lips, 98% of what they're drinking is actually just water. As we'll hear, not investing in water quality could cost your business an even greater fortune. So what kind of water makes for an excellent espresso and well-running coffee machines? And how should hospitality business owners embed water management systems into their day-to-day operations? To explore the world of water for coffee, we're speaking with one of the world's leading coffee water scientists, Dr. Marco Wellinger, Research Associate at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. We'll then be speaking with two coffee shop operators to understand how they manage water in their operations. We'll be joined by Jon Whyte of Bean Coffee and Mike Logue, Wholesale Director at Redemption Roasters. But we're starting this episode with Sam Scoles, Head of Beverage at BRITA Professional UK, to understand what commercial solutions exist for water filtration. I'm delighted to be here today with Sam Scoles, who's Head of Beverage at BRITA Professional UK.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. What are some of the elements in water that need to be managed by sort of water treatment?
There's several things that you need to really consider. And Sky, the Specialty Coffee Association, actually have a water recipe that focuses on certain parameters. And as experts, their advice is that if you can control those variables, you can really hit a sweet spot and then you can have perfect water.
Yeah.
And they recommend is that if you can get your water free from chlorine, if it has a total hardness of between 50 and 175 parts per million, an alkalinity of between 40 and 75 parts per million, and a pH between 6 and 8, then coffee can fully develop its full flavour and aroma.
Yeah, slow it down. There's three variables there that you're controlling. So hardness.
Let me help you out. First things first, it wants to be free from chlorine, okay? You need to use a filter that has a really, really good way of removing any of those kind of unwanted tastes and odours that are found naturally in water. So we use activated carbon, and we use activated carbon because it's burnt at really, really high levels, which means that the porous area, the surface area of the carbon takes out all of that unwanted chlorine. It absorbs it like a sponge.
Yep.
Then you've got your different kind of mineral content. So total hardness.
Yep.
So when you think of water hardness, it's measured in something called TDS, which is total dissolved solids. But the total dissolved solids, it's just a measure of everything in the water. Okay,
Yep.
so you're measuring all of the cations, the anions, the non-forming hardness ions and salts, total hardness, permanent hardness. I could go on. It's confusing. All you actually really need to be able to control is the total hardness and the alkalinity. Now, the really important one is the alkalinity. That's what we also call the buffer capacity, because that is what has the ability to buffer and counterbalance those coffee acids, okay? So if you get that right, the alkalinity, the buffer capacity, then you're going to get the right extraction on your coffee.
So you've got the right alkalinity measured by pH, is that right?
Alkalinity within the water recipe language is not alkalinity on a pH scale.
Okay.
So I'm referring to alkalinity in its buffer capacity.
Okay.
From a pH perspective, that yes is acids and alkalinity. They at Sky recommend a range between 6 and 8.
Of course, all that is as free as chlorine as can possibly be as well.
Absolutely. Don't forget to take out the chlorine. Yeah.
Wow. Now, why does water treatment help to preserve coffee equipment?
There's a chemical reaction that happens when water is heated. And if there is too high a mineral content within the water of the wrong types of minerals, which is why you need filters to take that out, then you can end up with scale. You absolutely don't want scale, which can be very costly for the user. When you've had your equipment break down and you've got to have a new boiler, or you've got to have your level probes descaled, or it's not working and you've lost revenue because you've had to turn consumers away because your kit's down and you're waiting for a service engineer to come out. And people tend to spend a lot of time and energy and effort and resource in sourcing the right equipment, sourcing the right beans, sourcing the right grinder, and then just forget the water treatment because we take it for granted because it's safe for us as humans to drink, but it just really isn't safe for equipment or for the quality of the beverages.
Now, what about the nuts and bolts of installing and, what's the cycle of replacement of filters, etc.?
Right. There's 3 golden rules you need to bear in mind when you're looking at water filtration. And the first thing you need to do before you put one of these big cylindrical vessels onto your piece of kit is you need to test your water, okay? You need to know what you're starting with so that you can set it up correctly because it just isn't a one-size-fits-all. That's super simple. It can be done with one of our drop test kits, and then that will tell you how hard your water is and what parameters you're starting with. Secondly, you need to treat your water and use a filter that's going to have technology sophisticated enough to control that blend regardless of what your starting point is. And what we use is we have an IntelliBypass, and that allows you to control the blend and maintain consistent filtrate, not only in mineral content, but also in pH. Let's say you're in London and you've tested it at 10 degrees of carbonate hardness. We've got a matrix that allows you to understand, well, what do I set this IntelliBypass at? And that would tell you to set it at 40%. You would turn the bypass to 40. And then what that does, 100% of the water is filtered, but only a certain part of it is going through the technology that reduces the minerals.
Okay.
So all of it is filtered in terms of it's all going through the carbon to be able to take out the chlorine, those unwanted tastes and odours. And then the other percentage is going through the minerals. And then what comes out as a filtrate at the other end is the perfect balance.
So there's test,
Yep.
treat,
Yep. And one more thing.
Yep.
Repeat. So we always advise that you change your filter when it's reached its capacity or at 12 months, whichever comes sooner.
Fantastic. Sam, thanks for being with us here today on Fifth Wave.
Thank you so much for having us.
Speaking of operators, now let's hear from 2 of them to understand the real day-to-day challenges they're overcoming when incorporating water solutions into their businesses. First up is Mike Logue, Wholesale Director at Redemption Roasters in London. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
I want you to tell us a little bit about Redemption Roasters. How many stores do you have?
We've got 8 stores now, all around London. Most of them are central London.
And how many espresso machines would that represent?
Yeah, we have 8, one per store. We have 3 group slayers in most of our stores. We run a wholesale operation. Within that, we've got our own sort of training rooms. We have, various espresso machines. And then in the roastery itself, we have, espresso machines that we do a lot of quality control and testing and things like that on. So there's loads of pieces of equipment in our portfolio.
And do you need filters on other equipment other than the espresso machine? So your regular boilers, where you're making sort of pour overs or batch brews, do they also need filter systems?
Anything where water is heated up and boiled, yes. Drinking water also. But the internals of a coffee machine require a filter just to protect them. And the key really is making sure that they're maintained on a regular basis. Preventative maintenance is probably the biggest secret to looking after your coffee quality long term and your equipment. This equipment isn't cheap. You've got to look after it like you would a car. And that's the analogy that we often use when we're selling equipment to clients is you get your MOT every year on your car, and you need to do the same for your coffee equipment. And the biggest and most important part from our perspective, I think, is changing those water filters on a regular basis.
So if someone is sort of unwise enough not to sort of do a preventive maintenance on their sort of water filtration, and what's the worst that can happen?
Well, the worst that can happen is the machine goes down, and then you can't serve coffee.
At all?
At all. If you get a blocked group head, then you've got no water coming through it. You might go down to a single group, but, real worst case scenarios is you get a blockage in the whole system and nothing's coming out, and then you can't serve coffee. So, for those businesses where coffee is key to their service, that's a huge loss. For a filter that's going to cost you a couple of £100, to maintain on an annual basis, you'll lose that in the first hour. If you think about spreading that cost over a period of 12 months, it's really nothing. Break it down by coffee, the cost disappears, really.
And how does someone know when they have to service their filter?
Depending on what filtration system you're using, there is pieces of kit out there that can give you, reminders about when they're due to be replaced or how much water you've used. And each filter has varying sizes, 10,000 litres, 30,000 litres, et cetera, et cetera. That's irrelevant to most of us. We don't know how much water we're using. I think speaking to your coffee provider or the equipment provider, they'll be able to give you an indication of how much water you're going to use over a period of time. And whether you choose to, change your filters every 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, that's up to you. We tend to, try and keep things simple for our clients and work towards a 12-month preventative maintenance cycle.
Great. Well, recommendation here from Mike is look after your water preventative maintenance in order to look after your business. Thanks, Mike, for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And now let's speak with Jon Whyte, co-founder of Bean Coffee, a chain of 20 coffee stores across Liverpool and Manchester, which he founded in 2008. Jon, thanks for joining us today on Fifth Wave.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about the sort of state of equipment that you have across your 20 sites.
Well, obviously espresso machine in every site, boiler in every site as well.
And they all require some form of filtration? I understand you've got some good water in Liverpool.
Yeah, pretty good. Well, I suppose it's a balance between you don't want it to be too hard and you don't want it to be too soft. The water is pretty soft in Liverpool and Manchester. In Liverpool, we get Clark readings of around 4.5. And then in Manchester, it's as low as 2 in some parts. So pretty low. We found ourselves in the position where we don't want to filter out any more because you don't want to take any of the minerals out that you need for great coffee extraction. But obviously there's that balance against the maintenance that you don't want to have the scale forming in the machines. So we tend to use just a carbon block to filter out obviously the chlorine and the taste and odour and the bacteria side of things, but then it doesn't take out any minerals that we need for the coffee extraction. Because I think if we softened it past that point, it would probably be a little bit too soft and then it'd be going against the coffee extraction.
So in terms of running this program through your business, what's required to keep the water right?
Yeah, it's an annual program. So we have it diarised, obviously from when sites open. You want to be changing it annually. So we keep the filters in stock. We work with a local supplier, AquiCure, we have done for some years. We tend to test it. We do test it quite regularly because we found over the years, it seems to have changed really. And next to Liverpool, the Wirral, it's only separated by obviously the River Mersey. And you can have Clark readings as high as 20 on the Wirral. But literally a couple of miles away, 2-3 miles away in Liverpool city centre, you've got this 4.5 reading, which is obviously much, much, much softer. But I think over the years, I wonder if they've changed the way the pipes are routing. So I think it is really important that you test regularly. So we tend to test it as often as every 6 months. We don't tend to see any scale, but we do test regularly just to keep on top of it and just to make sure that we're not seeing any changes in the supply.
So even at a local level, you're getting different water at different times of the year.
Yeah.
What can happen? Like you said, a machine can go down. For someone that runs 20 coffee sites, what's the impact on the business?
I mean, it's huge. It's obviously people coming in, it's a big deal when someone doesn't get the morning coffee, isn't it? You're walking in, you're looking forward to coming and get your coffee, you don't get it. It's not just the loss of that immediate sale, but it's what's that going to do? Is that customer going to go to another shop? They're going to go somewhere else? They're going to change the habit? Is it going to be the last straw?
if it does go down, what are the steps that sort of a manager of a store has to take?
Our head roaster, Alex, he looks after the machines. So he's in contact with Mulmar, who look after the engineering for us across the region. So, we'll try and get someone in as soon as possible. We don't tend to carry spares, in stock. So it's a next day delivery generally. It's a big deal. If your machine goes down, it's a big deal for us. It's something we try and avoid. A few years back, one of our customers, their boiler was so corroded that it developed a hole in it. And it started leaking out all over the electrics.
Oh, my gosh. Ooh.
So, I don't know whether that was scale or whether it was like corrosive acids or, or what the deal was why that happened. But obviously that's worst case scenario, because if you're into replacing the boiler, that's a big job.
Well, Jon, thanks for joining us here today. That was fascinating to hear. Thanks for joining us.
No, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
I think the message is pretty clear. Invest in water solutions to ensure the perfect tasting coffee, avoid disruptive and costly breakdowns, and save money on equipment in the long term. And you can achieve all this by simply implementing a scheduled water maintenance plan. And now for even more detail on the pure science of water for coffee, our final interview is with Dr. Marco Wellinger of the University of Zurich of Applied Sciences. Marco began his career over 10 years ago when he undertook a PhD in analytical chemistry, and he became increasingly interested in coffee and now conducts cutting-edge research in water and sensory analysis for coffee. So now let's plunge into the depths of the science with one of the world's leading coffee water academics. Dr. Marco Wellinger, thanks for coming on Fifth Wave today.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So, as far as I understand it, there is a standard filtration systems. There is also reverse osmosis. Is there any advantage and disadvantage to either of those methods?
Yeah, the thing is, most waters are dominated by limestone.
Yeah.
If you dissolve limestone in water, which is quite a slow process and happens over the course of months to years, you get the same amount of total hardness and alkalinity. So most waters out of the tap, if you're in Central Europe, in the UK, but also in the US, most waters will group along this range where total hardness and alkalinity is about the same.
Right.
Then you have like different minerals, for example, gypsum, which is only increasing total hardness but not affecting alkalinity. And this kind of changes things. So if we first focus on like the roughly 2/3 of the tap waters, which are equal in total hardness and alkalinity, you can use a decarbonizer to get down both of them. But there's kind of a limit of how much you can use it if you start with very high values. So something in excess of 250 ppm calcium carbonate, you have to be careful because you shouldn't feed then this softened water directly to your espresso machine. Because in the process of bringing down both of these values, you're creating carbonic acid. It's quite a weak acid, but if you create a lot of it, it could still corrode your boilers. There was these incidents they had in Denmark where they started with a very hard water and then they decarbonized it down to almost pure. And then they had, I think, half a dozen steel boilers which corroded through within less than a year.
Wow.
So there's kind of a limit of how much you should decarbonize. We usually say the limit for us is that you shouldn't decarbonize by more than around 250 ppm calcium carbonate. So this leads me kind of to the outliers. So for the waters that are not in this range of having an equal total hardness and alkalinity, if you have a much higher total hardness, that's these kind of gypsum waters, then you can just use a softener, which only reduces total hardness to get near the optimum. And then lastly, there's the reverse osmosis, and this just produces pure water. So no matter where you start in terms of your composition, what comes out of reverse osmosis is pure water. And then what people usually do is kind of mix it back with a bit of the tap water to get the mineral content back up a bit.
I want you to tell us a little bit about sort of different geographies. I mean, how different are geographies in terms of the water?
Yeah, I have some data mainly on Europe, but I also have a good data set on the US. And there are huge differences in water composition. And in terms of hardness and alkalinity, what we mainly concerned with, they're determined basically by the geology. So if you have limestone in your soil, then usually you get hard water. So if you look, for example, in Europe, you see clearly that any places that are in regions with limestone rock, and they'll end up having much harder water than places that have, for example, volcanic soil. Because volcanic soil often has stuff like granite in it, which doesn't contain any limestone or any calcium carbonate, so your water stays soft.
Yeah.
I mean, besides what's in your soil, that's kind of the primary determinant of where you will end up. You have time, of course. The longer your water stays within your soil, within the soil, the more it will pick up. And then you also have granularity. So actually, in Switzerland, we have higher values in the regions where they are not like outside of the Alps. In the Alps, it's actually mostly softer.
Yeah.
And this is basically particle size. So we all know from coffee that the finer you grind, the quicker it will extract. And the same goes for dissolving rock in the soil. If you just have large boulders, they have a very small surface area, they will dissolve much slower than if you have these kind of glacier residues, which a big part of Switzerland is filled with. So you have this general tendency that you can see that some parts are kind of similar to each other. And if you look at like worldwide picture, most people have water that is too high in hardness and alkalinity. And they're usually too high by a factor of 3 to 4. I'd say is kind of the bulk of tap waters.
Wow. So 2 to 3 times higher in hardness and alkalinity in general than what would be normally good for making coffee.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's, a really strong case for getting water right. I wonder if you'd tell me a little bit about, if you've done any research on sort of how taste might change, along the spectrum, a little bit too hard towards a little bit too soft.
Yeah, what we mainly investigated is the impact of water alkalinity on the acidity of the coffee. That's quite a simple relation where you could say the higher the alkalinity of your water, the lower the acidity of the beverage.
Right.
But again, this is very much depends on the type of beverage you do. If you compare like the average, let's say Italian espresso, at a beverage ratio of 1 to 3. So the beverage weighs 3 times as much as the coffee dose. And you compare it to filter, where you have a ratio of 1 to 15, you have 5 times less water for espresso than you have for filter. So the water doesn't really have a big chance in neutralizing a lot for espresso, but it does for filter.
I now see the reason why it's more important to get the water right for a filter coffee than an Italian espresso. Got it.
Yeah.
Because it's the amount of water relative to the beverage.
Yeah, and in terms of hardness, we generally saw that a lot of coffees, they react positively if you increase hardness in terms of aroma. That aroma tends to be better if you're not at 0 total hardness. So it seems that the optimal range can vary a lot depending on your roast style. A couple of years back, we've also seen some contenders. One was Tetsu Kazuya, who eventually won the World Brewers Cup, and Michaela Wahlgren, who placed second. And they both used straight RO water, which is pretty much at 0-0.
Yep.
And apparently they brewed fantastic coffees, because otherwise they wouldn't have placed first and second in the Brewers Championship. But in my experience, this only works if you also optimize your roast style to this kind of water composition.
Yeah.
So there seems to be quite a lot of play depending on what's the best water composition, depending on your roast style also.
Well, Dr. Marco Wellinger, thanks so much for joining us here today on Fifth Wave.
Yeah, thank you as well.
There's no doubt about it, unless you are lucky enough to live in a city with excellent water for coffee, you should avoid putting unmanaged tap water into your expensive coffee brewing equipment at all costs. And if you're interested in going deeper into coffee science, you can now take an online course and earn yourself a certificate of advanced studies in coffee excellence from Marco's University. We've linked it in the show notes. Managing water in your coffee program means you are ultimately delivering great tasting coffee to your customers whilst looking after the economics of your business. And that's all this week for the 5th Wave podcast. Please subscribe to the 5th Wave wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd really appreciate a good rating if you enjoyed this show. Follow us on Instagram, 5th Wave Coffee. That's the number 5, followed by THWAVE Coffee. Tell us what topics are important to you so we can make the show more relevant to you and to your business. This episode was produced in the one and only Serendipity Studios in glorious Camden, North London. It was produced by myself, Jeffrey Young, Hannah Heath, James Harper of Filter Productions, and sound engineering by Chris Bristow. And this week's song is from the winner of the Coffee Music Project Coffee Theme 2021 competition. It's a cool track, Coffee Bean by Zanaya Harris. And until next time, stay safe and stay caffeinated.
I just wanna let you know, I hope you never let me go. Want your love like coffee bean. Yeah, it's extra cream. I like mine's real sweet. I want your love like unforeseen. Crazy movie scenes. Pretty past screen. I want your love like. Why don't we run away? Slow down and change the pace. My heart could never change.